So welcome. We are in class 7 of the Home Herbalist series, which is the cardiovascular class. And there's so much for us to cover today, and we are not going to get to it all, especially since we're also making herbal honeys and herbal vinegars in this class. And so we're going to cover a lot of the basics in today's class, but then there's so much more in your notes. So definitely check out your notes for more information, including on other aspects of heart health. So we're going to start off with our tea. And this is just kind of a great tea that's emphasizing a lot of the herbs that we're going to be focusing most on today, which are our general heart tonics. So these are herbs that have a lot of different benefits in the cardiovascular system. They tend to be very antioxidant rich, very polyphenol rich, which is a type of tannin based antioxidant compound that's really prevalent in a lot of berries and herbs and certain other vegetables and foods. And they tend to be very helpful for reducing inflammation, reducing oxidative stress. So they're antioxidants. They often are very helpful for the lining of the blood vessels, which we would call our endothelial lining. That's like the skin on the inside of the blood vessel, which we want to be smooth and flexible, but that's not always the case. And so having a very polyphenol rich diet and using very polyphenol rich herbs tends to help promote general heart health. And many of these herbs have their own little additional specialties to the cardiovascular system. So cardio meaning the heart, and then vascular meaning like the blood vessels. So first and foremost, we have hawthorn berry as well as hawthorn leaf and flower, and that's hawthorn berry in the picture. There are a lot of different species of hawthorn that are used interchangeably, and we are going to talk more about hawthorn later in the class. But that is sort of like your all that in a bag of chips cardiovascular herb. Very safe, very well tolerated by almost everybody, but yet so many different ways it benefits the cardiovascular system. In addition to everything I just mentioned, it also over time tends to be very nice for modulating and lowering blood pressure. It can be helpful for folks that are dealing with cardiac rhythm issues. So things like tachycardia, palpitations, irregular heartbeat. It also is a tonic for the heart itself, for the muscles of the heart, and can help repair or protect from damage. Just many, 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 many benefits from it. We'll get more into it later on. And, you have these kind of two basic parts. Really, it's a couple parts, but you've got the berry and then you've got the leaf and the flower. And so the leaf and the flower are harvested in spring. The berry is harvested in fall. And they have similar properties. The leaf and flower maybe are a little bit stronger, but the berry is just so lovely and nourishing. And so oftentimes we use a combination of the two. And sometimes we just turn to the berry. So it really depends on what you have available and what you feel like. It is a little bit more astringent, it's astringent in general, but the leaf and the flower are more astringent. And so sometimes that can be a little bit too much for somebody palatability wise, or maybe they've got a sensitive stomach. Whereas the berry can be a little astringent, but less so. It's partly because of those tannin based compounds. Polyphenols are a type of tannin. They're within the category of tannins. They're not quite the same as like bark and cinnamon and those things as far as being used for diarrhea and all that, for tightening and toning, but they are still within that general category. So they are a little quirky for medicine making as a result, and you might notice a little bit of that like puckery astringency to it as you're eating it. You might even notice that when you're having like green tea or blackberries, blueberries. Those polyphenol constituents can leave a little bit of that puckery astringent quality in the mouth. Hibiscus is also in here. That's another primary herb. It also gives us some good vibes, because that's what's really making this tea so beautiful and red, is the hibiscus flowers. And we'll be talking more about hibiscus in a little bit. And we also talked about hibiscus in the first class. But that's another really great cardiovascular tonic, very polyphenol rich, particularly rich in those pigments, those anthocyanins and anthocyanidins that are the blue, purple, red pigments. Really a powerhouse for that. I mean, berries have them, but hibiscus holds on to it so much more nicely. So even though hibiscus is not actually a berry, we often combine it in very fruity teas because it adds that sourness, it adds that fruity flavor, it adds all that beautiful color and all of the good benefits that go along with it. And there's been really nice research in the last, decade or so on hibiscus for blood pressure in particular, although it probably benefits a lot of other aspects of the heart too. Rooibos is in here as well. That's another red pigmented tea. And it's a little bit gentler. It doesn't have as many overt, like knock your socks off benefits for the cardiovascular system. It benefits, but it's just not quite as powerful. And so I consider this to be a little bit more of a supportive and maybe even a harmonizer because it's got this nice soft flavor that helps bring everything together. We've also got linden, which is adding a little bit of a unique, almost honey-like flavor. It's also got some astringent polyphenols in it and some mucilage as well, although I don't usually ever notice that much mucilage from my linden or my hibiscus for that matter, even though technically you do have a little bit of it in those plants. But linden tends to be really popular for supporting the emotional aspects of the heart and stress when it manifests in the heart. And it tastes good, makes a great tea. So we added it to the tea blend. We've got some rose hips in here as well. And that's also just supportive for like vitamins and nutrients and bioflavonoids and a little bit more fruity flavor. This tea actually tastes a little bit more rose hippy than sometimes I notice it tasting. And I did not add honey to mine today, but honey is a lovely ingredient as well, which, just makes it even more sweet and pleasurable of a tea, but it's quite nice unsweetened as well. And I see Pam's commenting that this tea is nice for a broken heart. And yeah, it's definitely, a lot of these herbs do have a reputation, especially hawthorn and linden in honey, as well as just helping to soothe and nourish a broken heart. So there are other herbs we'll talk about for that too. So, and Hope mentioned that this is subtly tart and enjoyable. And yes, today's tea especially is tart. And that's mostly from the hibiscus, although you do get some tartness from the hawthorn and from the rose hips as well. So lots of statistics about the cardiovascular system. Just some basic things to help us be present with the heart and recognize all that it does. It pumps about 2,000 gallons of blood per day. Now, we don't have 2,000 gallons of blood in the body, but because it's circulating through, that's like how much ultimately ends up getting pushed through, even though that's, through recirculation. But that's pretty impressive. The heart, like so many areas of our body, it's really impressive what these, small little organs do each day and every day to support our health and vitality. So the heart also beats about 100,000 times per day, which is, again, pretty impressive. And the heart is a fist-sized muscle. So it's not tiny, but it's not huge. And it has a very complex system of electricity and muscle action that it does what it does in order to pump that blood through the whole body, as well as in combination with the lungs to infuse the blood with oxygen. And that oxygen is going to help fuel energy in the cells throughout the whole body. So it really is very important for transporting a lot of things. It's one of our major transport systems of the body. And we've got the blood, we've got the lymph, we've got the kidney systems and a few others, but it's one of our major transport systems for various compounds to go through the body. But oxygen is one of the biggies because that is what's going to be sort of giving life to the body and giving fuel to the body. It's also a really important symbol of life and emotion. We have a couple different organs of the body that are associated with our beings, our essence, our emotions, our soul, and the lungs, the brain, and the heart are three of the biggies. Also, you could argue that the gut is a major seat of emotion as well. But the heart is a real biggie. And a lot of times we do feel emotions in our heart, and our emotions can have a really profound impact on our cardiovascular system as well. And it is absolutely essential to our lives that we have our heart running. You can have all your reproductive organs removed and you can still get along just fine. Reproductive organs are like the lowest organs on the totem pole of what's essential to have in our bodies. They're nice and they're important. They're especially important for the perpetuation of our species. But the heart, like we need a heart. And if, while we do have technology that allows us to replace hearts or put in pacemakers or other things, if your heart suddenly stops, that's the end if nobody's able to get it restarted or replaced or treated very quickly. And here's a little picture of how your blood vessels more or less move. You've got your big blood vessels. So this is the vascular system. These are all the blood vessels that go from your heart, kind of out to the periphery. And so we start off with really big blood vessels that are coming from the heart, especially the arteries. Arteries are going away from the heart with fresh blood, and then the veins is the return trip, and with sort of your spent blood waiting to be like reinfused with oxygen. And it's because of the oxygen content that we have red veins, red arteries, and blue veins, related to the oxygen content of the blood. And so it starts off with these really big arteries, and then it gradually breaks down into smaller ones, the arterioles, and then down to the teeny tiny ones, which are the capillaries. And then as we get to the return trip, they gradually kind of get bigger and bigger as they return back to the heart. And so I love to think of the cardiovascular system as a set of roadways throughout the body. There are a lot of useful analogies that we can make there to help us understand the anatomy and physiology of the body. And so if you think of your heart as like the capital city of your body, and it is where so much of the manufacturing is happening, so much of the good stuff is coming out, and we're like sending out what we need to all those communities. And at first we're going down the central artery, like that's what we call like that big highway that goes into the city, again, artery. And then it breaks down, and so as you get into the capillaries, those are like those little back roads. So they're important, they get things out to the periphery, and they also pick things up from the periphery, but they're really small, a little slower and all that. And then eventually things kind of get bigger as we move our way back to the city again. And on that return trip, it's further away from the heart. The heart is really what's moving that blood through. Those pumps are what's pushing the blood through all those blood vessels, which is so amazing that this one organ is moving all that blood through all those vessels. But as we start to get back to the veins, like they're further away from that pumping action. So things can get a lot more sluggish in the veins. That's one of the reasons why we see problems with, varicose veins and vascular insufficiency and issues like that. One of the things that the veins have to kind of help move the blood back towards the heart is they should have a system of valves, and the valves ideally are going to make it so that the blood can only go in one direction. We're also usually with the veins going against gravity to go back up to the heart. And so the valves are there to only allow the blood to move in one direction. But sometimes the valves give out. So that's where we can sometimes run into issues like varicose veins and hemorrhoids, and those kinds of issues is from the lack of tone of the vessels in general, and also the valves not working properly and breaking down. We probably won't get too much into the vein and vascular health piece of things. A lot of our general cardiovascular tonics totally apply for that area, but there is more information in your notes for the vascular issues, because certainly a lot of people have that to deal with. So we'll move along. There's a really lovely quote. We're going to get to it later, though. So I was bummed because I did a bunch of edits to these notes, and there was a whole section that I remember writing, and then I went to go add a few slides to represent that, and it wasn't in the notes. So I must have accidentally deleted it when I was moving things around. So I'll have to add it back in again the next time I teach this class. But I was a little disappointed in that. I discovered that shortly before class. So unfortunately, with heart health, we do have a lot of cardiovascular issues. It is the #1 cause of death. As far as I am aware, I don't know if that's changed post-COVID, but some updates I've made to this since COVID began, but that's one stat I don't think I've checked out. But also COVID does increase the risk of cardiovascular events. So it probably is still the #1 killer in the United States. And we have a lot of different forms of heart disease that can be deadly. So heart attacks, strokes, coronary artery disease. We also have issues with arrhythmia, congestive heart failure. And each one of these is a little bit different. But basically, they tend to be a breakdown of that system of the cardiovascular system. So in things like congestive heart failure, the heart can get inflamed and it's just not as good at pumping blood through, and it's not as good at oxygenating blood. So we tend to get really fatigued, and the cells in our body are not getting nourished properly with the oxygen and other nutrients as they should. And there are a lot of other things that move through the cardiovascular system: iron, our red blood cells, our white blood cells, immune cells, hormones travel through, certain nutrients travel through, and so there's lots that makes its way through the bloodstream. It is one of our primary transport systems, and it's one of our fastest transport systems for moving things around in the body. And we tend to see that, for everybody, we have it being cardiovascular disease being the leading cause of death, but we tend to see it particularly in men before we get to a certain age, in women as we go through peri and postmenopause. We get some protection from cardiovascular disease with estrogen, but as estrogen starts to wobble and drop off, we have an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. And certainly other genders can also be affected by this. And then also most racial and ethnic groups, particularly folks who are Black, Indigenous, and Latinx, tend to have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and events. A lot of the same complexities that we talked about with blood sugar issues also apply to heart disease, and blood sugar and heart disease are very closely linked. It's not always about blood sugar when it comes to the heart health, but it oftentimes is, especially when we're looking at cholesterol and hardening of the arteries and all of that. So some of the things that we can see that can go wrong with the cardiovascular system is if there's a lot of wear and tear, if there's a lot of inflammation, if we're eating foods that aren't quite as vital, if we're not exercising as well as we should, if we're under lots of stress, if we have a higher genetic risk, if we're not sleeping well. All these things create some amount of wear and tear on the lining of our blood vessels and can create some inflammation. And then as that inflammation starts to occur, one of the things that the body will do is, it's kind of like if your roadways are getting traveled on by big, tractor trailer trucks, and, like the maintenance is important. And if the road just can't bear what's going on with it, it starts to break down, and the texture of it is not quite as good. And so then the road crews go out with cholesterol, and we'll take that cholesterol and try to use that as a patch job. So kind of like you would fill a pothole. That's sort of what the body is trying to do with cholesterol, to say like, oh, let's patch up this inflammation here, let's patch up this inflammation there. But as time goes on, as you know from driving on a road that's covered in potholes that have been patched up versus a nice smooth new road that's been well maintained, that it's still a pretty bumpy ride, and sometimes that patch job breaks loose, and then that can cause some big problems. And so that's sort of what happens with a heart attack, is that oftentimes there's that plaque of the hardening of the arteries, and that plaque that will build up. And then if that dislodges, or if it just builds up and builds up and builds up, and the blood isn't getting through quite as properly, you end up not getting blood flow to certain areas, and that can be really problematic. You can also end up with a stroke, which is a sort of similar phenomenon that's happening in the brain, because we do need good circulation to get to the brain. And arrhythmias are a little bit different. That has more to do with the rhythm and the electricity of how the heart is pumping, and sometimes things just start to get a little out of whack there. And as I mentioned, congestive heart failure, oftentimes there's a swelling of the heart, and it's not able to just pump through. It's like a tired heart, and it's just not able to pump things through quite as well. So there are a lot of things that are linked with an increased risk for heart disease that can affect it. So how the health of your heart, where your blood sugar is at, stress, inflammation, those are some biggies. Risk factors would be having high cholesterol levels, which if you have high cholesterol levels, that's a sign that something isn't quite right in the system of the body. So that's one way in which it's a risk factor. And then also, one of the things your body does with it is it does try to patch up the sides of the blood vessels. It might be a little bit more complicated than we often give it credit for. A lot of times we're like, oh, the cholesterol is bad, let's just shut down the cholesterol and everything will be better. It's not really that simple, because part of the reason, the underlying factors for why we have more cholesterol and why there's inflammation in the blood vessel lining, those are the real issues at play. The cholesterol being high is a problem, but it's like further downstream. And so if we just shut off the cholesterol, there can be some benefits to that, but really what we want to do is back it up and figure out, like, why is the body making too much cholesterol, and why is the lining of the blood vessels inflamed, and why is the body feeling like it needs to layer the sides of the blood vessels with this cholesterol, and let's address that. And that's more likely to have a benefit on the morbidity and mortality. Morbidity is the reduced quality of life from cardiovascular disease, and mortality is dying from cardiovascular disease. So high cholesterol is definitely one of our major risk factors. Smoking, because it creates so much oxidative damage and inflammation on the body, is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Being overweight, having diabetes, which we talked a lot about in the last class, not being as active. I mean, we are meant to be moving on a regular basis. That's going to help our blood move. That's going to strengthen our heart, because our heart needs to pump a little bit more when we're moving and exercising. And so that's going to be strengthening. It's exercising our heart. That's cardiovascular exercise, is exercise that is working the heart and needing to, have more oxygen pumping through. Diet, what we're eating, healthier or less healthier foods can have a major impact. So certainly having more animal foods, there's debate on that, but certainly more animal foods, more trans fats, more simple carbohydrates, maybe saturated fat. That's a little bit more controversial. Dairy is kind of controversial as far as whether they're good or bad, but definitely the more plant foods. We're going to talk about diet, so we'll get into that in a bit. As we age, wear and tear the body. As we age, our risk tends to go up. Certain medications can increase our risk. Interestingly, metformin, which is often used to control blood sugar, which can be really important to do and may be beneficial in some ways to the heart, also can make cholesterol levels go up and can have some downsides as well. Estrogen replacement therapy, birth control, those can also have some potentially modest negative effects on cardiovascular system health too. Increased blood pressure is a major, it's a disease in and of itself, and it's a major risk factor for having increased risk of death or morbidity from heart disease. Genetics can play a role, but we have epigenetics. Genetics is what you're born with, but epigenetics is how you live, what you eat, what you do has an effect on whether those genes turn on or turn off. So while you are stuck with your genetics, you do have some control in how those genetics ultimately plays out through the choices that you make. Also, some people are just born with defects in their heart, and that's not anything that they might not even be aware of it. Sometimes they're major, sometimes they're minor. We had a very prominent herbalist several years back who just had a heart attack out of the blue, and they think it was probably that he had a congenital heart defect that nobody ever knew about, and there was just the right kind of pressure on the point, and it happened, and he should have died. Thankfully he didn't, and through a lot of work from modern medicine, holistic, and prayer and family and support and just good luck, he did make it through and is on the other side, which is great. But sometimes people just have something underlying, maybe more or less serious. Also, certain chronic illnesses and acute illnesses can affect the heart. So Lyme disease can, especially chronic Lyme, can affect the heart, and COVID-19 can also certainly affect the cardiovascular systems. Not in everybody, but in some people. And some of it's from that acute state, also just general, like any kind of intense infection has also had a history of effect on the cardiovascular system. So a lot of what we see with Lyme and COVID-19 are not really unique to just those. Things like myocarditis have also been seen with other, kind of intense infections if somebody experiences them. And so you can end up with inflammation of the heart. Oftentimes inflammation is one of the key things. You can end up with rhythm issues, blood pressure wobbles. Interestingly, a lot of the long haul COVID and chronic Lyme disease issues are very, very similar. And there are probably some similar etiologies where like the immune system is overreacting and aggravating some of that autoinflammatory process, is probably part of it. But they can cause their own sets of damage and put people at a higher risk for cardiovascular events through clotting, rhythm issues, POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, I think, something like that. But basically, it's when people are moving and changing position, their rhythms and their blood pressure can get kind of wonky and they feel really faint and dizzy, and blood just isn't quite getting where it should. And so that's a potential side effect of both of those issues that we sometimes see. We won't be able to get into that too much in today's class, but I do have some information that I added to your notes about that you can check out. So lots and lots of stuff. This is all kind of the bad news, but now we're going to get to the good news and all the wonderful, beautiful things that we can do that are going to support our health. So, one of the questions people wonder is, can I avoid having heart disease? Can I avoid having a stroke? Can I avoid having a heart attack? And while nothing is ever a guarantee, it's definitely possible. So 2021, the European Society of Cardiology published a thing, and they found that up to 90% of the risk of stroke, heart attack, and peripheral artery disease can be explained by factors that we have control over. So things like smoking being one of the really big ones, lack of physical activity, high blood pressure, which often we can control with things we'll be talking about, or meds. Having those blood lipids that are raised, like cholesterol, triglycerides, having too much alcohol, poor eating habits, abdominal weight gain, which is associated with insulin resistance and all the stuff we talked about earlier, diabetes, and other psychosocial factors. So diet recommendations are a biggie. And, there can be some debate on what diet is healthiest for the heart and what diet is healthiest for the body. But I'd say that for heart health, the research is pretty solid that we're looking at having more plant foods, more whole foods, fish, nuts, high fiber, especially from whole grains, beans, legumes, veggies, fruit, and having less animal foods, animal products, especially red meat, especially saturated in trans fats, especially, everybody can agree that trans fats are problematic. Alcohol, salt, especially in excessive amounts, sugar, and especially sugary drinks seem to be really implicated. So this was part of their report. And while they didn't look into it, I do think that herbs can also be really helpful. So we will be talking about herbs. And kind of like with our blood sugar class, the herbs are going to creep in a little bit at the beginning, along with our diet lifestyle piece. And then we'll get a little bit more overtly into the herbs. I also want to take a moment and mention that the heart is that seat of emotion that I mentioned earlier. And there's a really lovely book that just got published recently by Karen Rose, and it's the art and practice of spiritual herbalism. And so Karen is mostly focused on the spiritual side of herbs. And one of the things I love about the book is it's organized by body system, kind of like mine is. It's very approachable, very easy to read, but it makes a lot of connections through the emotional, spiritual, and physical aspects of the body, as well as brings in a lot of different cultures. Karen herself comes from a couple different cultures, including African and I think indigenous, but I can't recall exactly at the moment, but brings a lot into the book. It's really beautifully done and very approachable. And so she actually opens the first section of the book is on the cardiovascular system. And her quote is that our hearts and minds need a balanced relationship. This energy of the heart is outward and giving. So you think of like our heart, like going out and giving these nutrients. So the heart's relationship to giving and receiving is primal in heart health. The heart's whole design is to give and receive. As the heart gets blood from the body, it flows through the chambers, through the lungs to receive oxygen and back out to nourish the body. Joy and flow are the lessons of the circulatory system. So, there's a lot that we can be thinking about our emotional well-being and nourishing our emotional well-being alongside the more like physical aspects of supporting the cardiovascular system. So There are a whole bunch of herbs that are known as heart gladdening herbs. And there's not a lot of information in the class notes today about them, but we do have a few slides. I'll mention a couple of them. And also, if you go back to the nervines and the class number 3 for relaxation and mood, a lot of these herbs are covered more in depth there. So roses, motherwort, lemon balm, holy basil, linden, hawthorn. Those are just some really nice heart nourishing, heart gladdening, emotional support herbs. And then if we're looking more for calming, both calming like a agitated heart as well as calming the mood, we might think of passion flower and skullcap. And then just kind of as a little extra, I will note that valerian, because of its muscle relaxing properties, can also physically relax the cardiovascular system and dilate the blood vessels a little bit. So rose, really phenomenal tonic for the emotional heart, especially emphasizing the aromatics of rose. So I really love using cold extracts, cold water over the course of time, honey, syrups, elixirs, glycerin extracts done with a cold but longer term infusion to really pull those aromatics out, or just sprinkling roses in your food, sprinkling it in your salads. And it just has a very traditional use for supporting us when we're dealing with PTSD, grief, anxiety, overwork, heartbreak, trauma. It's just very, very, very nourishing. And it is a little bit heart opening. So you may want to think about when you're using rose. It's a great time when you're really able to nourish yourself and open, be in a place where your heart is a little bit more open. We don't always want our heart to be open. Sometimes we need to protect ourselves a little bit from the extremities, but roses are really, really, really wonderful. And then we have, let's see if our slide is being a little quirky. We have linden, which Kiara was said earlier that she's obsessed with linden these days. And I feel like I should play with linden more than I do, because it's such a delightful herb. It's really popular throughout Europe, as well as through some aspects of Latinx culture as well. It's sometimes called lime tree, or tallul is usually what we're referring to in French aromatherapy. And while you can work with the leaves, and it's cool that the leaves are heart shaped, although the heart is like a little off kilter. You'll notice that they don't exactly match up. You can kind of see that here as well. But really, really cool plants. But what we particularly are using are the flowers and the bracts. So this is the flower that's just starting to open. It hasn't actually opened yet. And then you can kind of see it in this picture, but not well. But there's this little light colored, sort of like oval, oblong, leaf-like structure, and that's called the bract. It's associated with the flower. And then there's one here too. And then this is a different species or variety. So the leaves are a slightly different shape, but it's this open flower or just opened flower. And then here's the bract. It's usually just a little light color, a little limey colored. And if you've ever had a chance to be out with linden when it's in bloom, it's amazing. It's like sweet, syrupy, soapy, perfumey. It can almost smell too perfumey. There was a time where I was there's a tubing place in northern New Hampshire, and where you wait to go tubing and down the river, they have you sit under a linden tree, but the bathrooms were nearby. And so I was sitting under thinking like, they have some really like smelly floral thing in the bathrooms. And then I looked up and realized it was the linden tree. So then I appreciated it a little bit more. It wasn't some sort of artificial, but it almost smells like hotel soap. And when you drink it, it's got aromatic, but also kind of like a cherry honey kind of flavor. It's very honey-like in the taste. And you do notice a little bit of astringency. It's got some tannin, some astringency, as well as some mucilage as well. And so classically in Europe, we're going to consume the flowers and the bracts and maybe some of the other leaves as tea. And we're going to use that to just relax at the end of the night. It's a nice way to just kind of unwind. It's like if you think of that beautiful summer night where you have a nice meal and you're hanging out with friends, and there's just a little bit of, you can hear the peepers in the air, and you're just kind of relaxing, and it's just that kind of a nice place. And so oftentimes people will consume linden as a tea after dinner to kick back, relax, maybe digest your food a little bit better, relax your heart, prepare you for a nice evening and or sleeping. And it is a nice general tonic for the cardiovascular system and hypertension, and supporting and nourishing the heart as well. And I would love to hear too, please, please, please feel free to add your own personal stories to the chat box of recipes that you've really loved to make, or any personal stories about herbs that have really touched you in your life, and I will read them. But I think that's really nice to hear what other people have used and really enjoyed and what's helpful for them. Linden also has a reputation of being helpful for hypertension as well. Gentle, but nice over time. Also, motherwort really deserves some attention. It was interesting. I've been attending, Andrew Bentley has a long haul COVID course going on right now with the American Herbalist Guild. And the class that we had on Monday was on cardiovascular health. And the two herbs that he tended to turn to most often, especially when it came to rhythm and that POTS issue, when people's blood pressure and blood rhythms are going off when they're moving around, were hawthorn and motherwort, and finding motherwort to be really helpful. I have also found motherwort to be really helpful in clients who are dealing with hypertension, and for a lot of other things too. I just love motherwort, and we talked about it in that nervous system class. It is very bitter, so that can lead to some of its health benefits. Bitters do have benefits in the body, can be very grounding, but it also makes it probably not our best tea herb. I more often will use it as a tincture. But as far as the heart goes, it's really nice for feeling kind of like a warm hug, relaxing, helping when stress is manifesting in the heart, or when the heart stuff is stressing us out. It tends to be really helpful for quelling palpitations, anxiety, other kind of dysrhythmia issues, maybe even a little bit of like, not chest pain like you are having a heart attack that requires going to the hospital, but just kind of like, when you're just getting little pings in your heart because of more minor things going on, or emotional things going on. And just a really lovely mood herb. And it is calming, but it's usually not too sedating. And it's relatively fast acting too. Most people will notice some benefits from it within just a few minutes, especially if it's panic and stress that you're feeling in the heart. Passion flower, just kind of very calming, cooling. So sometimes it can make a appearance in cardiovascular formulas for hypertension that's stress induced, tachycardia, that kind of thing. But it is more sedating, so that might make it less appropriate, maybe better at bedtime. And it may lower blood pressure as well. So this one I might be a little bit more careful with it, making sure that it's matched up to the person. So we have a question: can you make a good strength motherwort tincture from dried herb? I have not worked with dried herb, but I do know some herbalists, including Andrew, who do work with it as a dried herb. So if it's a good quality dried motherwort, it probably still has some benefits. So try it out, maybe compare. Maybe one of these days I'll get a hold of some good quality dried motherwort. I never have enough to really play around with it, so I usually just do the fresh extract here. But maybe one of these days I'll do a comparison and see if I notice a difference. But if that's what you have access to, definitely go ahead and work with the dried, and then maybe try the fresh out if you have a chance later on. Definitely all those pillars of health are hugely important. They are the most important things with everything, but especially with heart health. So exercise, healthy diet, mind body balance, getting good quality sleep, those are really, really important key pieces to having a healthy cardiovascular system. Hawthorn's great and all, but if you're eating like McDonald's and you're not exercising and you're super stressed to the max and you're not sleeping, the chances of you having cardiovascular disease are still pretty high, even in spite of the hawthorn. So, you really need to be attending to these to the best of our ability. And there is an issue in Japan. They have, I think it's called karoshi. I may not be pronouncing it right, but it's death by overwork, and that it's such a stressful work environment over there, with really long days and really high stress jobs and really demanding jobs, and a significant lack of quality of life focus, that folks end up dying because they either have a heart attack, a stroke, or if they kill themselves. And it's so prevalent that they have support groups specifically for families who've been affected by it. And they've invested in forest bathing research for that being out in nature of supporting us and helping to reduce our stress. But we also want to think about like, maybe we should have more vacations. Maybe we should have less, shorter hours of work. Maybe we should be shutting off work when we're done with work. Maybe we should have a more reasonable schedule at work to the, as best as we're able. But, I think it's a pretty big difference of work ecology from like Japan, which is pretty intense, to the United States, which is still relatively intense, but not quite like Japan, to some countries in Europe, like Germany and especially France, where it's much more laid back and there's a much greater focus on work-life balance, especially in France. So, maybe we can somehow make our lives more like we're living someplace like France. Heart healthy diet is big, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on diet just in the interest of time and focusing on herbs, but this is a really big area for us to focus on in our health and our well-being for the cardiovascular system. And a lot of what we already talked about for the blood sugar support is also going to apply here. So having that low to moderate glycemic index diet tends to be really helpful, particularly when it comes to heart health, focusing even more on the slow burn carbohydrates. So probably not a paleo diet. I would think more of a vegetarian, vegan, Mediterranean diet that's rich in those complex carbohydrates and plant foods. And there could be some amount of meat that's grass-fed, wild, pasture-raised, and or fish, but minimizing the animal proteins in general seems to be more associated with healthier cardiovascular system health. And having more, sorry if you can hear the road noise. It's a popular road to drive on, especially when the weather is nice and it's a beautiful day today. Having a rainbow of colors, because we're going to get a whole slew of different antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, polyphenol, pigments, carotenoids, all these different pigments work together to support our cardiovascular system to improve circulation, decrease inflammation, decrease oxidative stress. Having lots of herbs and spices, tea, dark chocolate, those tend to be really rich in those beneficial compounds as well. Really emphasizing the vegetables. Like if we can possibly just have 5 to 9 servings of produce per day, heavy on those vegetables, that alone would do really amazing things for our cardiovascular system, especially when it comes to blood pressure, but also when it comes to everything. If there was one thing to focus on, that would be a really great thing to focus on. Fiber is also really important, and that's one of the areas where we can run into problems with the more paleo style diets. While they can still have fiber from the vegetables and the root vegetables, they tend to really de-emphasize some of the other like nuts and seeds maybe, but especially like legumes and whole grains are not part of those diets usually. And legumes and whole grains, the type of fiber that's in them seem to be really, really helpful for supporting heart health and supporting healthy cholesterol levels and all of that. So really focusing on fiber. Mushrooms are also a really great source of fiber as well, but getting it from a variety of different sources and not saying like, oh, well, I don't need fiber from this source because I have it from this one. More about just trying to get it from all of them, unless there's like a really legitimate reason why you should be avoiding a particular food group. Rutin is a compound, it's a sort of polyphenol-like compound that is, or it is a polyphenol that is in certain foods. So buckwheat, it's very high in that. It's also relatively high in hawthorn, linden, citrus rind, mulberries, and apples. Interestingly, a good amount of our cardiovascular tonic herbs have rutin in them, in addition to buckwheat being one of our big food sources of it. And rutin tends to be really good at supporting the tone of the vascular lining. So folks who are having vein issues or just want to support their cardiovascular system, could be taking rutin as a supplement, but also could be eating rutin-rich foods. There's a really nice lecture that I linked in your notes, as long as I didn't accidentally delete it, from Mimi Hernandez at the American Herbalist Guild. And it's one of the public ones. So actually anybody can access it. It's on the public webinar archives. And she's got one on cardiovascular health, especially vascular health, and then another one on berries and those anthocyanin, anthocyanidin pigments. And they're both really nice webinars if you want to delve more into that. But she shared a really great recipe that I had never even thought of, where she would do a tea of buckwheat and then drink a buckwheat grain tea. And that would be a one way of getting rutin in your diet. Some people toast it and then make the tea, and some people have it raw. There are pros and cons to both, but they're both probably good for heart health. Also, having bitters and sours for some of those same reasons that we talked about in the blood sugar class can also be helpful. Vinegar, there's been some studies on vinegar and heart health, both in lowering blood sugar and cholesterol, as well as with lowering blood pressure. Another really great tonic for the heart that we can really focus on getting from the diet, although certainly you can get it in pills and tinctures and other formats as well, would be garlic and alliums. And you can get cooked or raw, but raw is better than cooked. And especially if it's raw, chopped up, you really crush it, chop, and then that creates a chemical reaction in the air. And after about 10 to 15 minutes of sitting out exposed to the air, that is like the optimal medicine time of garlic. So then you can throw it into your recipe, or you can make medicine with it, or you can just eat it in something if it's not too caustic. Raw garlic can sometimes be a little bit caustic. And so if you're sensitive to that, then you could gently cook it and have it that way instead. But it does have some modest effects on lowering blood pressure and cholesterol. It's pretty mild for those two things. It's not a big number dropper, but it does seem to have some benefit there. But it's really helping to thin the blood, helping to decrease inflammation in the cardiovascular lining, helping to move the blood. It's very antioxidant, very anti-inflammatory. So it's a great heart tonic. And garlic's the biggie, but all of your allium family plants, including onions, chives, leeks, all those, walking onions, so many different kinds that we could be consuming. There is some research on, usually with the research, they're either focusing on allicin, which is the constituent that's aromatic and pungent that is most concentrated if you chop it up fresh and let it sit for 10, 15 minutes. But allicin compounds are in the sulfur compound, it's in the sulfur compound group. They're very unstable, so it makes it hard to preserve. And so some companies like Kyolic have developed aged garlic extract that don't have allicin in it at all, but do still seem to have some benefits and tend to also be more semi-odor free. So you don't end up like reeking of garlic quite so much. There are a lot of studies that have been done on those products that do show some benefits. As far as I'm aware, all the studies are funded by the company making the product, and the studies that I've looked at and been able to find were not very impressive results. So I do think it's a little bit overhyped, but might be beneficial. There does seem to be something there, but I would take it with a pretty big grain of salt. So we have a question. Do you know if allicin or other beneficial constituents of garlic are oil soluble? I avoid them for FODMAP reasons, but the infused oil is something I tolerate well. So yes, you could still infuse them in oil. The trick is that oil can get pathogenic pretty easily. So you have to eat the oil up relatively quickly. So that would be something that you could do. You maybe crush it up and let it sit for about 10 minutes, cover it up with some olive oil, maybe throw it in the fridge for a day, let it really infuse, and then use that over the course of the week. And you would get some benefits from that as well, because it's partly some of the sulfurs, but it's especially the starches and the fibers that are in it. And so you don't necessarily need to you don't necessarily need to have a FODMAP reaction from that. And you could also try doing a tincture. Tinctures work great, but you will like stink of garlic. Like it's this weird metallic aroma that emits from you. It will help keep ticks and bugs away, but it might also keep other people away, other critters away too. So does heat hurt these benefits? Yes, to some extent, heat does reduce it. You'll still get some cardiovascular benefits even if you cook it, especially if you let it sit and exposed to the air and then cook it after it's sat for 10 or 15 minutes. But it does lose a little bit of its oomph once it's been cooked, but it still does have some amount of benefits. So you can still enjoy it. Those are great questions. I've got some links to a couple different studies that you can check out. In one study, they found, this is one of the ones that was done on the aged garlic extract, that they found that it reduced heart attack and stroke risk by 28%. And the amount of blood pressure reduction was you've got the two numbers, you've got the systolic over the diastolic, 8.2 over 5.48 number on average reduction, which is nice, but not huge. Oftentimes, if people have high blood pressure, they want a bigger drop in blood pressure than that. I would personally, if I was really going for blood pressure support herbally, I would look to hibiscus in relatively large quantities and or motherwort as a tincture, as a little bit more potent, maybe also parsley and some of our diuretic herbs as well. Here's another study, randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial on garlic powder, and they used 1,600 milligrams per day for 3 months, and that also had a subtle effect. It reduced blood pressure by 7.7 over 6.7. Triglycerides dropped by about 40, which is pretty decent, and they did also notice improvements in insulin, appetite, and fullness, and a few other studies here as well. There have been some studies starting to look at it for things like COVID in a variety of different avenues and ways it might be supportive for folks dealing with acute, preventative, and or chronic states of COVID. Not going to be a miracle, but might be one of the tools in the toolkit. Also may be supportive for cancer, respiratory infections in general, and just as we're aging too. And you can check out Memorial Sloan Kettering Conservation Center has a really nice overview of the research, and you will notice that there are a lot of really mixed results of showing benefit, no benefit. Part of that's because there are so many different types of extracts, and because it's not a very stable set of constituents that garlic has. Omega-3 fatty acids are also really helpful. We'll take a break in a little bit, but not quite yet. So omega-3 fatty acids have a couple different ways that they benefit our body. If you end up taking the Beyond the Home Herbalist series that happens this fall, in those classes, omega-3s come up again and again and again. In this series, the main topic that they come up in is the cardiovascular system. They do also help support mood and brain development. So there's a little bit of a mention in the mood class too. But omega-3s are a type of essential fatty acid, essential meaning that our body can't make them. So we have to eat them in our diet in order to get them. Where we are what we eat, we're going to get them from our food. And so the best place to get them is from cold water fatty fish. So this is a place where you might make an argument for not an entirely vegetarian or vegan diet. You can get plant sources as well. Flax oil, chia seeds, hemp seeds do have ALA, which is another type. EPA and DHA are what's in fish and some other animal foods, and ALA is what's in the plant sources. But the plant source is a lot less bioavailable, and it's a lot less concentrated, and your body needs to have a lot of different systems in place in order to convert it into the format that your body can utilize, whereas the fish form is like immediately utilized by the body. And so the fish form really is the best, but I think having the plant form can be helpful too. And I do know folks who follow vegan diets who still seem to get benefit from flax oil and flax seeds and chia and walnuts and purslane. But if you really want to emphasize it, the fish is where it's at. So there are a couple different ways in which omega-3s benefit us. One is that our body utilizes omega-3s, especially the EPA and DHA forms, to make anti-inflammatory compounds. Other fats in the body can be used to make pro or anti-inflammatory compounds, but omega-3s pretty much always go down the anti-inflammatory compound path, whereas some other fats get used to make prostaglandins, which tend to have more of a pro-inflammatory effect, also leukotrienes. And we tend to see those especially in a lot of our other animal fats like arachidonic acid. tends to get used to make more of those pro-inflammatory. And our body needs all these things. So it's not that we don't want, arachidonic acid and prostaglandins and leukotrienes, but we want to de-emphasize it. We want more of the anti-inflammatory. So one thing omega-3s do is they help support decreased inflammation. The other big way in which they're important is they are a major part of the structure of all your cell linings and your nerve cells as well. So having adequate amounts in the diet is really important. And it's really easy for us to be deficient in omega-3s because there just aren't a lot of food sources. We need omega-6 too, but we get omega-6 super easily from all sorts of different foods, whereas omega-3s have a little bit limited sources. So we're more likely to be deficient in them, and our ratios of omega-3 to 6 might not be optimal. So that's why they're beneficial. Fish is going to be about 8 times more concentrated than plant sources as far as providing omega-3s to the body. And no matter what format you're using, if you have a spoonful of oil, it's easier to get a more concentrated amount because 1 tablespoon of oil equals about 14 pills. So even if you did a teaspoon, you're still getting like almost 5 pills of fish oil in just a teaspoon of oil. It is fishy tasting. And one of the downsides to the omega-3s, whether you're getting them from plant or from fish, is they go rancid really quickly, especially if you heat them or you expose them to the air. They just go rancid really fast. But even in the fridge or the freezer, they'll eventually go rancid, but it'll slow them down a little bit. So a lot of the fish oil and flax oil and other things on the market are rancid. And once they're rancid, now they're bad for you. They're almost like they're a trans fat. So that makes it a little bit challenging. So having fresh fish, that's almost like if you ever eat, I love to eat like sardines and mackerel and those kinds of things. And I'll even eat them out of a can. And you might notice that when you first open the can, they taste pretty good. But if you don't finish it and you put it in the fridge and you come back to it a day later, it's more fishy. That's the rancidity process happening. If you have flax oil or flaxseed products and they taste fishy, it's gone rancid. Fish oil is a little fishy. Rancid fish oil is very fishy and makes you burp up fishy and all that. Flax and flax oil and chia, they really shouldn't be fishy. And if they taste fishy at all, they're probably rancid. And so that's one of the challenges of these is getting fresh, good quality. And then I would store them in the fridge or freezer. Even once you open it, I keep my pills. I personally take fish oil in pill form, and I keep them in the refrigerator. Even though it's not required, they do keep a lot better. And I don't, if I order through the mail, I don't order in summer because I don't want them to get exposed to all that heat in transit. There are lots of other good fats that have benefits. So olive oil, avocados, and nuts tend to be particularly supportive for cardiovascular health. Not so much because of omega-3s, but for other fats like monounsaturated fats that are good. So this is our natural breaking point, and we will come back momentarily to talk about more herbs, more specifically, and other aspects of heart health. I'm also going to kind of turn on and off my honey a little bit. So we'll take a 10-minute break. It is about 7:40 my time, so we'll come back at about 7:50. So I will see you shortly. Feel free to include any questions or comments, stories, and I will get to them when we come back from our break. So we have a few questions about fish oil that I want to answer. So I'll just kind of go back to that slide. So one comment was that they heard that there with fish oil pills, you really need to do your homework. Some out there could do more harm than good. Is that true? And what fish oil brand do I use? So yeah, that goes back to that. At least I assume one of the big problems with fish oil is that it can go rancid really easily. And once they become rancid, they're bad for you. They're not good for you anymore. So freshness and quality are really, really important. There is also the risk that they could concentrate some of the heavy metals, mercury, and things that are just naturally present in a lot of our waterways, but it's usually not that big of an issue with salmon and fish oils and cod liver oils and those kinds of things, but it could possibly be an issue. But oftentimes the fish that they're using to make fish oil are ones that are not as high of a risk of being high in heavy metals. But I would look potentially to brands that use some sort of like a molecular distillation, do quality control testing for heavy metals and PCBs and other compounds. And the company that I personally use that most people, have a lot of faith in is Nordic Naturals. They tend to be kind of above and beyond in quality. And so for fish oil, that's the brand that I personally take and really like. There are probably a few other brands out there that are good as well, but that's the one that I trust and use. And then the other, for if you're going to be using flax products, I really like Barleans. They do a really nice job because the freshness is an even bigger issue with flax. And Barleans, whether you're getting flax seeds or you're getting flax oil, usually those are that's their products are some of the freshest that are out there. And then I would store your oil in the fridge and use it up quickly, or I would store your seeds in the freezer, and that keeps them pretty well, and they stay loose in the freezer, so they're easy to work with that way. um, yeah, but those would be some potential options there. There's probably more I could say, but those are the basics. And then let's see. Okay, great. Yes. Other folks who are also using Nordic. That's one of the brands that people really like. And you can get ones that are emulsified. Barleans actually make some pretty good emulsified fish oils. They're a little easier to digest and they taste a little better, but you also get a lot less fish oil per spoonful. And personally, I do take the pills just because I'm really not compliant with the oils, with the liquid oils. They end up going rancid on me. So I use the high potency pills personally. So heart tonics, this is where a lot of our herbs come in, and you will notice that with a lot of our heart tonic herbs that they are red, that like doctrine of signatures, they look like the part of the body that they are helping. And they're often very antioxidant, very anti-inflammatory. So hawthorn is one of our biggies. It is just so amazing. To me, it's like it's proof of a higher power because this plant is super benign as far as toxicity goes. It's very well tolerated, very food-like. You can consume it in pretty large doses. In fact, it's better if you have it in large doses. And yet it has so many different ways in which it benefits the heart health. And I just think it's really cool that there is a plant out there that has so many different benefits for the human cardiovascular system. So I just gonna kind of pull up my notes so I make sure I hit all the highlights for hawthorn. So some of the biggies, well, I'll just kind of look at it to make sure that I catch all the things. So one of the things is that it strengthens the muscles of the heart and the pumping ability of the heart. So you actually get better blood flow, stronger heart muscle, and it can protect the heart muscles from damage and also help them repair, whether we're talking about heart attack, post heart attack, infections. This would be one of the herbs that we have long considered to be supportive for myocarditis, post-infectious, long before COVID was even a thing, and also can be helpful for supporting rhythm and blood pressure, particularly lowering blood pressure, but also possibly modulating blood pressure. It's antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. It's a modest blood pressure lowering plant, probably a little more than garlic, but maybe not quite as potent as hibiscus would be my personal take on it. And it is also a bit of a nervine, so it does nourish the nervous system, but it particularly nourishes the nervous system as it relates to the cardiovascular system. It's got this very heart opening kind of effect. It relaxes the musculature of the blood vessels, which is a good thing so that they can dilate, and blood pressure tends to be lower with that. It also helps improve the endothelial lining of the blood vessels over time. It helps fight oxidative damage and inflammation. A lot of it relates to the proanthocyanins or oligomeric proanthocyanins, OPCs, PCOs. They're basically the precursors to those blue, red, purple pigments. So OPCs and PCOs are actually more white in color, but they have a lot of similar benefits as those blue, purple, red pigments. They're related, and they're also tannin-based polyphenols. And let's see, they also tend to inhibit angiotensin converting enzyme or ACE inhibitor, and that's part of how they work to lower blood pressure over time. What else? Mhm. Often over time, folks have fewer episodes of like angina, heart rhythm issues, and all of that, tachycardia. Some people are different. I have had some clients over the years who it seemed like Hawthorne almost like strengthened their heart stuff, but that's usually pretty rare. It has a long history of use for congestive heart failure. It's not, congestive heart failure is very serious. And oftentimes, if you have congestive heart failure, you might be on medications that might interact with Hawthorne. That's one of the cautions of Hawthorne is herb drug interactions. Doesn't mean you can't use it, but you'd want to be seeking professional guidance and introducing it really carefully because you may need to adjust the medications accordingly and have a lower dose of the medication. So things like digoxin as well as blood pressure medications, it can sometimes synergize them, and you don't necessarily always you don't want your blood pressure or heartbeat regulating drugs to get stronger. You want to be in a state of homeostasis, so you'd need somebody who's able to observe and adjust accordingly. um, yeah. So the downside to Hawthorne is that it is something that you usually need to take in relatively high doses, and it is something that's best consumed over a long period of time. So it's not something that you take it and like that day you're like, oh, I feel so much better. It's more that you take it and then after a month, 2 months, you're like, huh, like things are going a lot better. I'm having a lot fewer of these episodes, or my blood pressure is becoming more in range, or whatever. But it's the kind of thing that you'd be thinking of as food for the heart, something you would consume regularly, especially if you knew that you were at a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Maybe it runs in your family. This would be something you could start earlier, or even later if you were adding it. You just want to make sure that it's okay with whatever medications you might also be on, or that you introduce slowly and adjust accordingly. So it is relatively high dose. That for that reason, while you can take a tincture, it's because of the large quantities, it's usually not practical to take it in tincture form. You'd end up with a lot of alcohol, and it would also be very expensive in that format. So I know I usually only use it in tincture if for some reason I want to throw it a little bit into a formula. But if it's really what I want somebody to be taking, I might have them do a concentrated extract in a pill, or solid extracts are something that I love. It's like a really, really concentrated extract that's also usually alcohol free. Um, you can make your own really concentrated recipes. Jim McDonald has a nice recipe that I did link in your notes for this concentrated syrup. And sometimes I'll add apples to it too, to make like an apple saucy syrup. And then I'll put it in the dehydrator and I'll dehydrate it into a fruit leather. So I take like a strip of fruit leather a day, and that's pretty easy way to take it. And it's nice because it's also alcohol free. But really the less alcohol formats are generally better, just because you can concentrate them down more and you don't have to worry about getting too much alcohol with your medicine. Andrew Bentley actually does do alcohol extracts. He does a lower percent alcohol, but he has people take anywhere from 5 to 15 mil a couple times a day. So like a whole ounce of tincture per day is basically what he has his clients take, where that just doesn't seem practical to me. I'd rather have folks take jam or make powder and then, you could do an electuary, or you could make a tea and then drink the sludge, or, work it into recipes. There are a lot of different ways we can work with Hawthorne. It does potentially interact and synergize with blood pressure meds and digoxin. So that's something you'd want to be careful about and work with your doctor if that's the case. I have heard some really impressive stories, and oftentimes people do feel like just because blood flow is better, oxygenation is better, people over time just start to feel better, more energized, that kind of thing. Subtle, but big improvements. Because if you're not getting good oxygen throughout the body, it's one of the reasons why people might feel really fatigued. It's not the only reason somebody might have fatigue, but it's definitely a side effect of not having good pumping action. I had one of my colleagues, her husband had a heart attack, and she had him on a whole regimen alongside his conventional care. And when he went back, I think it was 1 year later, they could not see any sign of the heart attack on the test that he was doing. That it was like the heart had completely healed up, which they were really surprised. But she attributed it to the Hawthorne use. So just such a nice plant. So that's the big takeaway from this class is hawthorn. Also hibiscus, which we talked about in the first class as a tea herb, does seem to have some really nice benefits for heart health. Warning, if you decide to do this as your monograph, you're going to have a harder time finding it in a lot of the herbals because until recently it was just the yummy, pretty beverage tea. And it isn't until more recently that at least European literature has been focusing more on the medicinal benefits of it. So this is a plant that comes more from African, Nigerian traditions, and then came to the Caribbean through the African diaspora, and is now also very popular throughout the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, South America, really popular where it's sometimes called Zobo, sour tea, Rosa de Jamaica. Jamaica is spelled like the word Jamaica. So very popular in those communities, which are often communities that don't get elevated in Eurocentric herbal medicine, which is where a lot of our herbals are coming from. And also, like I said, until more recently, there wasn't a lot of scientific literature talking about its medicinal benefits either. But now there's a lot of really cool research, not surprisingly, from the color that it seems to be really helpful for heart health. And some of the good research is also coming out of Nigeria, Mexico, and other areas of the world where this herb has more of a tradition of use. So classically consumed in tea, very water soluble constituents, usually not as a tincture. You could try it, but I've never heard of it being used that way. You might be able to try it in pill or powder, but it's usually used as tea. And the studies that have been done use a pretty significant amount, like several cups of tea a day, up to 2/3 of an ounce of dry hibiscus, which is a lot, and then steeping it in like a liter of tea and drinking that throughout the day. So you'll be going through a pound of hibiscus, like 1 or 2 pounds a month of the dried hibiscus. So you'd be going through a lot of it. This isn't just like a light beverage tea. It's very sour, does have some blood sugar modulating effects, but in those studies at those doses, it has worked as well as a lot of different popular blood pressure medications. So one study showed it worked almost as well as lisinopril. Another study where they used a little bit more of it found that it worked as well as lisinopril. Another study found it worked as well as captopril. Another study found it worked as well as diuretic medications, which are pretty popular for for blood pressure. And it does have other benefits as well for blood sugar, insulin resistance, possibly a little bit for cholesterol as well. And it's just so high in antioxidants. And if you remember the part that we're using, I'm going to just minimize my camera here for those of you who are working off of the recording. So you might be able to see here, hopefully it's showing up on your end, that the flower is starting to go by. It's the part that's left after the flower. It's the sepals together that make the calyx. And that is the part, just turn my camera back on here. That is the part, those parts that are holding the flower itself. That's what we're really using, and it's the specific species of Hibiscus sabdurifa. There might be a couple other species that are used somewhat similarly, but they have this nice fleshy red calyx. In a lot of plants, the calyx is green. It's like the green bits that are holding the flower, but in the case of hibiscus, this type of hibiscus, it's fleshy and red. And so after the flower goes away, kind of swells up, you remove that, you take out the ovary, which is the green part in the middle, and then you use those fleshy outer calyx and dry that and use that to make tea. You could also work with it fresh if you're lucky enough to have access to it as a fresh plant. It doesn't survive the winters up here, so I only grew it once as like oh look, I grew hibiscus. But if you're in North Carolina or especially the Southeast, certainly warmer areas of the country, you might be able to grow it as a year-round plant, and it can get quite tall. And Juliet Blancaspor just came. There are so many herb books coming out these days. Juliet Blancaspor just released her Healing Garden book. She's in North Carolina, and there is a whole profile on hibiscus, including tips for growing it, but definitely more worthwhile to grow if you are in one of those warmer climates. Instructions for making a solid extract in the notes. So this is for mainly, you can make solid extracts of different things, but especially for hawthorn. Not exactly. Solid extracts in their typical sense are something that really requires specialized equipment. However, the recipe that Jim McDonald has in there, and then also I linked one for Guido has a recipe as well. They are kind of like a solid extract that you can make at home. And it's basically a really, really, really concentrated, condensed recipe that you start off with water. And then oftentimes you end up adding syrupy, sugary, sweet ingredients as well. With Jim McDonald's recipe, instead of simmering it in water, he simmers it in apple juice or apple cider. And then as it simmers down, you also get this concentrated cider syrup that is absolutely delicious and really complements the hibiscus quite nicely. And you can add other things to it too, like blueberries, mulberries, what you can even throw hibiscus in there. You can really, really play around with that recipe and do what you want with it. But there are 2 recipes in the notes that are like, kind of like a solid extract, but not quite a solid extract. There are 2 companies that make solid extracts that I'm aware of. Wise Woman Herbals makes the one that I personally use and really like. And then also Herbalist and Alchemist, which is David Winston's company, makes a pretty decent one as well. But I like for whatever reason, I just prefer the one that is by Wise Woman Herbals. But they're only berry based. And I really liked it. Gaia used to make one that was, Gaia Herbs made one that was the berry, the leaf, and the flower, and then they discontinued it. They still put it in their phytocaps and in their Hawthorne Supreme tincture blend, but they don't sell it as a standalone anymore, which is a huge bummer. Is it Jim's recipe that I turned into fruit strips? Yes, it was using Jim's basic recipe idea. I did add like actual chunks of apples, which made it a little bit more apple saucy. So I don't know whether or not his recipe as it stands would necessarily be thick enough to make a fruit leather. But with that, if you cook apples with it and then strain it through a food mill, that would come out. That's what I personally use. And I had blueberries and I don't remember, I did all sorts of things. If you watch the video on Beyond the Bottle that I have as a bonus class for this series, that's a whole bunch of different fun alcohol-free remedy techniques. I did a version of that in that class. We didn't finish it because it's a long process. And eventually I'm going to record a standalone video, but I haven't done it yet. I have hawthorn and cider in the freezer waiting for me to have time to do that. Probably won't happen anytime soon. So rooibos, this is another really great heart tonic. It's not as much to me a knock your socks off one for heart health, but it is a nice supportive. And the flavor is kind of like mild, plummy, a little fruity, a little bit like a mild black tea English breakfast. There's no caffeine in it. Very popular in South Africa where it grows. And it grows as a green broom shrub. And then when they oxidize it, kind of like when they oxidize green tea and turn it into black tea, as they oxidize rooibos, it turns it into a reddish color. And so that's typically how we are using it. And it does seem to have some liver protective properties, some cholesterol reduction properties, some triglyceride reduction, some blood pressure reduction. And usually we're talking about having like 6 cups of it per day. But cups are kind of small. It's like 6 ounces or so. So if you're drinking out of traditional American size mugs, you could probably get away with like 3 mugs of it a day would probably give a good amount. And you could totally add other herbs to it too, like hibiscus and hawthorn, kind of like we did with our heart tonic tea. So pomegranates, blueberries, purple grapes, Japanese knotweed, mulberries, so many of these different berries, these blue, purple, red pigments, butterfly blue pea flowers, which aren't even a berry, also hibiscus. These are loaded with the blue, red, purple pigments, those anthocyanins and anthocyanidins. And those are phenomenal for helping to decrease inflammation, acting as an antioxidant to fight oxidative stress, helping to improve that blood vessel lining, helping to potentially even reverse plaque buildup, helping to reduce heart disease risk, helping to strengthen the quality and the strength and the flexibility of capillaries, veins, arteries, varicose veins, fragility of the veins, all those things are capillary fragility. All those things are really helped by consuming these on a regular basis, and particularly having them fresh, frozen, powdered are okay as long as they're fresh and like still retain a lot of their vibrancy. Powders do lose their oomph over time. Same thing with dried. The dried you can use, but the dried also loses its oomph somewhat quickly. So having it recently dried and still retaining a lot of those pigments. Having 100% pure juice, but you really have to read that back label to make sure they're not throwing anything else in. And so those can be really great. You can also add those to your fruit leathers. So if you were making that simmered syrup, you could throw a bunch of pomegranate juice in with the apple juice as you're simmering down your hawthorn berries. You know, there's so much room to play around with these things, but having them in your daily diet. And yes, I did say butterfly blue pea flowers. I am excited. You'll have to tell me how the growing is. I am horrible with growing things from seed. So I have the seeds, but I haven't been successful at getting them to grow because I'm not a seed growing person. But yes, so you dry them. Butterfly blue pea flowers, you know, I don't know for sure that they have all the exact same benefits as berries and pomegranate. They taste very different. They taste kind of like green beans or peas or something. They have a pretty mild flavor, but their color is astounding for those butterfly blue pea flowers. And they're just super vibrant blue. And these pigments will change based off of the pH. So in a more acidic environment, they tend to be more red or more purple, more magenta. And then if it gets more alkaline, they'll get more of like a bluish purple or even blue or teal, depending upon the exact compound makeup and what the pH of everything is. So like I was showing my husband, I love to eat freeze-dried blueberries as a snack, and they look like a blueberry monster when I'm done, because it's just like I've got purple all over my face, my tongue, my hands. And then I brush my teeth with my baking soda toothpaste, and my tongue turns from purple to teal because of the alkaline of the baking soda in the toothpaste. Or if I put butterfly blue pea flowers in tea with like an alkaline nettle, it's more teal colored. It's a little weird. But if I put it in with hibiscus, which is more acidic, it just makes the hibiscus tea a little bit more of a reddish, purpley, magenta kind of color. So yeah, so you can definitely play around with them. There's not really so much research on butterfly blue pea flowers for heart health, but I'm using my senses and making associations. But certainly the berries have a lot of great research for them. So play around with all those, and you can come up with some really beautiful recipes. Also cacao and chocolate, which I think like, oh, well, it's not red, but it's still good. But I was taking a class with Mimi Hernandez recently, and she was showing pictures of the chocolate process. And apparently the cacao bean is actually magenta before it gets fermented and roasted and all of that. And that eventually it turns brown, but it's actually this really gorgeous magenta color at first. But cacao is very high in polyphenols, especially if you're using pure cacao, cocoa nibs, or dark chocolate. Milk chocolate's pretty diluted and not really, it's yummy, but from a medicinal standpoint, milk chocolate and white chocolate really don't have as much benefits as dark chocolate. And it's really the polyphenols where we're at. And there's quite a bit of research to support benefits for heart health, weight, satisfaction, blood sugar, just lots of really nice benefits, cognition, mood. Most of the studies with the most impressive results are funded by Mars and other candy companies. So there's a little bit of a grain of salt there, but it is a potentially beneficial remedy. Now, some people do find that chocolate aggravates tachycardia, atrial fibrillation, arrhythmias, tension, might make them feel a little bit agitated. So if you're one of those people, then chocolate's probably not the right remedy for you. But if chocolate is well tolerated, then having a few squares of dark chocolate per day can be beneficial. Green tea, black tea, white tea, all those teas that are part of True Tea Camellia sinensis are really helpful for cardiovascular system health as well. They contain EGCG, which is one of those catechins that is, it's in that polyphenol group, and in that tannin group, that's why you get that like puckery. There are actual regular tannins in tea as well, but also really nice, just general cardiovascular support, especially consuming it as tea. I am a little bit skeptical about green tea extracts in supplement form. And I would really, for safety reasons and for historical use reasons, I would go for it in beverage tea format, as long as you tolerate it. That's the short version of that. Now, a little bit aside, more for the blood movers, things that kind of help thin and move and warm up the body and get the blood circulating. Cayenne is a classic here, and studies do show that if folks, and these are epidemiological studies, so they're just looking at population trends, which doesn't prove causation, it just proves that correlation. But they do link that folks who eat more hot peppers tend to have longer lifespans, less stroke, less heart attack, less heart disease. There's a lot of traditional use in herbalism of using cayenne on a daily basis and in acute cases to help thin the blood and break up clots and reduce, sometimes even avert a heart attack as it's starting to come on. And that comes out of Thompsonian medicine from Samuel Thompson, who was actually from New Hampshire originally. This was going back oh gosh, I think it's the 1800s, if I remember correctly, 1800s or early 1900s. And then his work influenced pioneers as they were traveling west. And so the folks out in Utah and the Mormon community of herbalism still is really very fond of using cayenne in medicine in a lot of ways, including for averting heart attacks. Dr. John Christopher was a Mormon herbalist who has since passed on, but is very famous and has books and schools that are still running. And he would often talk about using cayenne as somebody was about to have a heart attack to helping avert it. Now, of course, I should say that if you think you're having a heart attack, you should go to the hospital right away. But do I also carry cayenne tincture on me in my purse and in my backpack because I'm a worrywart person? I definitely do, but I would still go to the hospital immediately if I thought something was going awry. Interestingly, when I've tried to look up research on cayenne, even though it does seem to be blood thinning, blood moving, may have some ability to break up clots, there's no study on heart attack treatment with cayenne that I have found. There are several case reports throughout the world, all cis men, none on women, oddly enough, who consumed large amounts of cayenne hot peppers and then had a heart attack. And so some of them were from eating lots of fresh peppers. Some were taking supplements for weight loss of cayenne. One person was just using a patch topically. Some have happened with people being pepper sprayed. It's pretty rare when you think of how many people consume lots of cayenne and do hot pepper challenges, but it is intriguing. And so the theory from the researchers has all been that by having this hot pepper, that stimulates the sympathetic nervous system response. So it stimulates this very strong sympathomimetic fight or flight response. And then the body responds to that by going into a hypertensive crisis. And then that causes the heart attack. That's the theory from the researchers. I personally wonder if going too quick, too fast on these blood thinning, blood moving herbs, if that might take some plaque that's on people's already hardened arteries, dislodge it and aggravate the likelihood of a heart attack or some other cardiovascular event. So I am personally a little cautious. I would, if you were thinking about using cayenne for heart health, I would have it by mouth as food and slowly kind of increase it in your diet versus just consuming a ton of it all at once. So that's just my personal caution. Other herbalists, a lot less careful and concerned about it than I am, but I just tend to be cautious. So generally really nice though, having cayenne on a regular basis in the diet and normal amounts is pretty good for heart health and probably really nice. But if you knew you had heart disease, if you knew you had a lot of stuff going on, if you already knew you had lots of hardening of the arteries, I would slowly introduce things like garlic and cayenne personally, versus just suddenly being oh, I should take lots of these and, taking a bunch of supplements all at once. That's just me. Cholesterol and triglycerides, there's a lot of background information in your notes that we're not going to have time to get into, but please, especially if this is an area of concern for you, read through and you'll get a lot more backstory on how cholesterol and triglycerides form and some of the different types of approaches that we can take to support it. But just to kind of like do the basic overview, because cholesterol is a pretty common health concern in this country, it tends to coincide with diabetes and insulin resistance and blood sugar instability and all the stuff that we talked about in the last class, which is why we did blood sugar before we do heart health. So if you remember, when we have too much sugar floating around the bloodstream, our body will package up the sugar with fat. It's one of the ways the body tries to get rid of it and make it into triglycerides. So if we have high triglycerides, there's a good chance that we probably have too much calories in general and specifically too many simple carbohydrates, and that's one of the ways that the body is trying to deal with it. Then our body takes the triglycerides and attaches it to cholesterol, and that's what makes VLDL, which you can think of as very bad cholesterol. Now, when it comes to cholesterol, the density lipoprotein, the DL is density lipoprotein. So lipoprotein, fat, and protein, because we're trying to move these lipids or these fats around the bloodstream. But oil and water, the blood is a water soluble type menstruum or type solution. And so oil doesn't really like go well in that. So the body patches it up with a little bit of protein so that it can float through the bloodstream a little bit more easily. So that's where you get the lipo or fat with protein together. If it's got a lot of the fat and less of the protein, it means it's less dense because protein is more dense and fat is less dense. So the very low density lipoprotein is generally going to have a much higher proportion of fat to protein. And then the low density lipoprotein is also kind of our bad cholesterol. That's also relatively high in the fat or the lipids comparatively to the protein. And the high density lipoprotein has less of the fat and more of the protein around it. So you've got your triglycerides, they bind to VLDL and make very bad cholesterol or very low density lipoprotein. And then that travels through the body. Your body ultimately drops the triglyceride load, and then that VLDL turns into LDL. And then as time goes on, your body is going to use HDL to kind of grab onto that and get the cholesterol out of the body. And so having more HDL is good for you. And while we need all of these things, having too much triglycerides, VLDL, or LDL are associated with having increased oxidative damage, hardening of the arteries, increased risk of heart disease, and all that. Whereas having more of the HDL is usually a good thing because that usually indicates that our body is able to like keep up and move. It's going to help get cholesterol out of the body further on down the line. And the liver is ultimately the liver makes the cholesterol. It's actually the one doing all this packaging up of things, but the liver is also what ultimately ends up cleaning it out of the blood later on. So we want healthy liver function as well. So I have some charts for, what's optimal, what's considered normal, what's pre-disease state for cholesterol, and what's a disease state. You may also want to look at things like CRP, which is an inflammatory marker. It's pretty generic. CRP could be indicative of all different kinds of inflammation in the body. It could be autoimmune disease, it could be an infection, but inflammation we know is bad for heart health. So that's one test sometimes doctors will do. Homocysteine is another type of inflammatory compound that is very associated with an increased risk of heart disease. So having homocysteine tested and VLDL are some other tests that you might see folks do to assess heart disease risk. So there are a lot of things that we can do to reduce cholesterol and reduce cholesterol production, reduce cholesterol absorption, improve how quickly it gets excreted from the body because, it comes in sort of through our food. And we do eat cholesterol, but it's really especially these other building blocks that we're eating that are used to make the cholesterol Our liver is in charge of making it and clearing it out. And then when it clears it out in the form of the bile. So it's one of the things that's in our bile. And then that goes out through our intestines and our colon, out through our feces. But if it, as it sits around and goes through the intestines, we do reabsorb some of it from our feces before we excrete it. So, so there are a lot of mechanisms at which we can affect our cholesterol levels. So besides, of course, the diet piece and what we're taking in, we can look to things that enhance digestion, and particularly bitters, because bitters are going to improve the rate at which we are absorbing our sugars in the first place. So they slow down that sugar curve. So we tend to have less of a hyperglycemic response to our food. So that's at the source of it coming in. Bitters also encourage the liver to excrete old cholesterol out more efficiently and pull it out of the bloodstream. And bitters also tend to enhance motility so that we have more regular bowel movements. So there's less chance for cholesterol to get reabsorbed. So artichoke is one of my favorites, especially artichoke leaf, but bitters in general tend to be really helpful there. Sours can also be somewhat helpful for somewhat similar reasons, especially vinegar and hibiscus have a bit of research on them. Fiber, especially soluble fiber, is also really important. We talked about fiber and soluble fiber in the blood sugar class. Same basic reason. It's going to slow down. If you're eating soluble fiber, it's going to slow down how quickly the blood sugar goes out. But then later on down the pike, as that soluble fiber comes in contact with the bile, it helps kind of hold on to that bile, hold on to those waste products of the liver, including old cholesterol, and get them out through the feces more efficiently without it being as reabsorbed back in. So there are a couple different ways that fiber benefits that. Also, if you're eating more fiber, often that's displacing those simple carbohydrates in the first place. Having reduced fats in the diet, particularly reduced saturated and trans fats, tends to be beneficial. There is controversy around saturated fats and how bad or not bad are they. I think it's more about moderation personally, but everybody agrees that trans fats are bad. Reducing sugar, especially those simple sugars in the diet, as we talked about in the last class, and especially that more plant-focused diet that we mentioned earlier. Of course, exercise, because exercise is going to help use up that fuel and strengthen our cardiovascular system in general. And a lot of those things that we talked about for blood sugar support with herbs might be helpful here too. And then most of our heart tonics that we just talked about also are helpful for cholesterol. If those things aren't enough, and I would hope that all those other things would be enough, but if they're not, you could try red yeast rice, which is like a natural statin that will go in at the liver level and dramatically turn down the liver's production of cholesterol. It's pretty effective, seems to be a little safer than conventional drug statins, but it still has the same mechanism of action. And the problem with statins and red yeast rice is they're not looking at the big picture, and they're just kind of shutting off something further down the line that might be a sign of bigger things happening earlier. Also, we need some amount of cholesterol, and so shutting it down that dramatically can sometimes have other downstream negative effects. It can lower our CoQ10 levels, which is a really important antioxidant for the heart. And it also, both red yeast rice and statins, they can cause some muscle and liver problems in some people. And I have seen red yeast rice do that in some sensitive people. And they also, let's see, there's one more thing I wanted to say about them. Oh, brain health. We need cholesterol to produce healthy hormones as well as healthy nervous system function, the lining of all of our nerves. And so you may see a deterioration of cognitive well-being with regular statin use as well. So I'm not a huge fan of them. And while red yeast rice is probably safer and still helpful and will drop numbers quickly like statins, it's not there. I don't usually recommend them. But when I worked in natural food stores, a lot of people did take them. Beta sterols, including beta sitosterol, are some fatty compounds that basically make it harder for the body to absorb cholesterol in the first place. So whether it's cholesterol coming in from the food that we're eating that contains cholesterol. So like eggs and shellfish are relatively high cholesterol foods. It kind of outcompetes that. And it also helps reduce the reabsorption. But you might lose some of your absorption of fat soluble nutrients like A, D, E, and vitamin K with beta sterols as well. They do seem to be a lot safer than red yeast rice, but it's usually not my go-to, but they do tend to work a little bit more quickly. So we have some questions. So I have a question about hawthorn. I'd like to make oxymel or honey syrups that I add vinegar to. Would it be worthwhile to make a concentrated hawthorn syrup and then add vinegar to that and some honey, or to make an infused vinegar and do a classic oxymel? Both of those totally make sense to me as ways to work with it. You would want to make sure that you get rid of most, if not all, of the water content if you're starting with water, because water is going to make it go bad more easily. But it does make sense to me to try to do like a simmered vinegar and then add honey to that later on. You'd probably add the sweetener later. But it's probably not going to be shelf stable. So that would be the downside to that. You could do just a regular oxymel and then just take it by the tablespoon. And the benefit of an oxymel, as long as you tolerate the vinegar and the honey, is doesn't have all that alcohol in it. So you could do that as well. And definitely concentrated syrups are a great way to use it. It's just that usually the concentrated syrups are not going to be shelf stable. So you'll need to put them in the fridge or the freezer to store them. You could also try doing that fruit leather, dehydrating it, adding it to some applesauce or something, and then dehydrating it as a fruit leather and having it that way too. Lots of options, but I don't have an exact recipe for you. I haven't done it precisely like that, so I can't say from experience. Blood pressure is really serious. So we really do want to pay attention to blood pressure, whether it's just subtly high blood pressure over the long haul or acute episodes of blood pressure. That is a really high risk for heart disease, for strokes, for heart attacks. Managing blood pressure can reduce the risk of stroke by 50%. Just all that pressure creates the likelihood for something to go wrong with the plumbing, for plaque to get dislodged, for something to break. It's just not a great scenario. And it's also really, really hard on the kidneys. And the kidneys can end up giving out as a result of high blood pressure that's not well managed. And I have seen that happen. I've seen clients who were not managing their blood pressure who ended up with stage 3 kidney disease. We have family friends and friends of friends who had uncontrolled blood pressure and one ended up dying at a young age of kidney issues within a very short period of time. Another one had a stroke that has completely debilitated and reduced the quality of life dramatically. And so these are not things to ignore. And herbs and diet and lifestyle can be really helpful, but if they're not working, then medications can be life-saving. And if the medications still aren't working, then you really need to implore doctors to dig deeper and figure out what's going on. There can also be kidney issues that could be making it hard for the body to maintain healthy blood pressure, because the kidneys do play a role in where our blood pressure is at. And then if we have high blood pressure, it's bad for the kidneys. So there's like a cycle there, but have them dig deeper and try to figure out why it's not working and what can we do about it, because it's not something to ignore. High blood pressure, it's something to address. And herbs can be helpful, but they're kind of modest. And if you have really high blood pressure, they may or may not be enough. And if it's moderate blood pressure and after a month or so the herbs just don't seem to be working well enough, you may need to look into other options. But there are, different ways to approach it. It might be worth seeking the guidance of a conventional practitioner and a holistic practitioner who can try to figure out what steps are appropriate and safe to take for your individual situation. And also there are some more severe issues that can affect blood pressure, like Cushing's disease, kidney disease, preeclampsia. Those are not things to be self-treating. Those are things you probably will need medications, and you definitely should have conventional medical supervision as well. But that's not to say you couldn't still incorporate some amount of the healthy lifestyle and all the stuff we were talking about earlier, diet, exercise, gentle exercise, and all of that. This chart is the American Heart Association chart for what's normal, elevated, high, stage 2 high, and hypertensive crisis, just so you can get an idea. So we've got the systolic, which is your upper number, and then you've got your diastolic, which is your lower number, which is basically like when there's pressure. And then when the, in that heartbeat, like the pressure, the relax, and the pressure and the relax. So where those two pressure points are what is being measured. And the nice thing about blood pressure is you can get a at-home cuff and you can monitor and you can know exactly where you are and you can assess your progress. You can try to figure out your triggers. There are a lot of different things that could trigger hypertension. It could be salt, it could be diet, it could be stress, it could be alcohol, it could be something else. It could be dehydration. And so you can kind of play around and see what is triggering so that you know what you might want to work on, or if your herbs are working or not, especially over time. The herbs tend to be slow acting. I also really like that there's this bigger chart from the European guidelines, and this is a lot more nuanced about like what to do at different stages. It's geared towards doctors, but it gives you an idea of like when you might incorporate lifestyle versus when it might be even more important to start looking at medications. And medications, they have side effects. They're not always super pleasant, but they're generally pretty safe and they can be absolutely life-saving. So if things aren't, if things are really out of whack, or if things just aren't responding to the natural approaches, it might be better to be on the medications than to not be on them. And you could still be working with holistic practitioners and seeing what you can do on the back end. And maybe later, if you've got things under control, you might be able to wean down or off of the medication, something you'd want to be doing with your doctor's guidance and supervision. But I have had clients who've been successful with that, but it might be that in that moment in time, it's just important to be on that lisinopril or beta blocker or hydrochlorothiazide or something like that. Let's see. So we do have some questions. So would it be seen as a blocked kidney when high blood pressure medications are off? I'm not quite sure what you're asking, so maybe you can ask it another way. I'm not quite sure what that means. So feel free to ask again, or you can unmute and ask too if you'd like. And while you're thinking about that, so let's see, I'll post it to the Facebook group. Okay, that works too. I don't mind answering it here too. I'm just not quite sure what you mean as blocked kidney and what you mean as high blood pressure medications being off. I don't know if you mean, so I would love to try to answer it in today's class, but I just need to understand the question. So the DASH diet does seem to be really specifically helpful for blood pressure, which one of the big pieces is lowering sodium, which you've probably heard about. Having too much sodium can potentially be a problem. Not everybody is salt sensitive, but having high sodium levels can be a problem. So it's not about completely eliminating sodium, but reducing it quite a bit. And so about 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day, which is about a half a teaspoon or so of salt. And then particularly you want to be careful because a lot of processed food and restaurant food and soups and things tend to be really, really, really high in sodium. So being particularly careful about those more problematic foods. Just eating more home cooked foods will probably reduce your sodium level pretty dramatically. Having particularly more vegetables in the DASH diet, and some of the studies, they've shown that increasing vegetables was as effective as reducing sodium. And of course, doing both things was even more beneficial. And then besides that, it kind of looks a lot like a Mediterranean style diet. Also having a lot of mineral rich foods, or even taking a mineral supplement with things like calcium, magnesium. Potassium is great too, but potassium is best from food sources because you can't get high levels in supplement format. But having minerals can help balance the sodium as well. That can be really helpful for your electrolyte balance and your blood pressure balance too. What else do I want to say about that? I think those are some of the biggies. There are lots of other important things, and I have a lot more information in the notes, but I do think I need to kind of move along. I'll kind of speed through these last few slides because we need to finish up our honey, and I also want to talk about vinegars before we close out today. So there's lots more in your notes. Things that I haven't really quite mentioned: stress support if stress is one of the problems, sleep support if sleep is one of the problems. Not getting adequate sleep is actually really bad for heart health, and we see more heart attacks on Monday mornings than any other day of the week, which we think is because of stress. I also think it's because we tend to throw off our sleep over the weekend, and when that alarm goes off on Monday morning, it's really jarring. So I personally think that's part of the problem as well. And let's see, coffee intake is sort of questionable. Definitely don't smoke. Diuretic herbs might be helpful. So dandelion, burdock, chicory, parsley, celery, nettle. Burdock and dandelion and chicory probably work better for folks of Latin ancestry. I can't totally explain why, but that was what my teacher, Michael Moore, said. He lived in the Southwest. And the folks that I know who have had great results for blood pressure for dandelion have all been folks of Central American, Latin American, Latinx ancestry, and all the gringos, which is mostly my client base here in New Hampshire, all the gringos did not respond to it that I tried. So for whatever reason, it might be more ethnically appropriate in certain people than others, but you can certainly try dandelion leaf and root. And if it doesn't work, don't be too disappointed, but it might. Vascular support, I've got tips for like blood movers, blood vessel toners, things you can apply topically to astringe, tighten, and tone. I also have more information that I added to your notes, but I have yet to make slides for, which we never have time anyway in class. But I did add some more information to your notes. There are some charts on cholesterol. And then some of the new stuff, I have a whole section on heart rhythm support, as well as a little bit of some side notes on congestive heart failure. We're seeing even more of this now post-COVID, and also in some cases post-vaccination. And so there are some herbs that can be supportive for that. So I've included like hawthorn, motherwort, maybe lemon balm, some of the heart gladdening herbs, some adaptogens, electrolyte support, and so forth. But keep in mind that congestive heart failure is pretty serious. It increases the risk of death pretty dramatically. And there's a whole bunch of diet and lifestyle. All the diet and lifestyle stuff tends to be really, really helpful and pretty safe. And you probably will need medical supervision. And with congestive heart failure, a lot of times people are on medications. As soon as you're on cardiovascular medications, you need to be really careful because a lot of the herbs we just talked about interact with a lot of different types of cardiovascular meds. So you'll want to seek professional guidance and or do your research to make sure that things are safe and appropriate alongside. So those are all those things. Are there any last questions about cardiovascular health before I stop recording and move on to vinegar and honey? I'm going to stop recording then.